Let's take a look here at 2011 micro question number 3. This is from Form B. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, so there it is there. So you have a monopsony graph that is given to you. Monopsony is sort of the flip side of monopoly. Very similar to the monopoly graph, but you're talking about factor market, right? And generally talking about labor markets. So you have one employer in the area, right? So in this case, we have the company Woodland, small town, which everyone works for Tremart, the local lumber company. Tremart is a monopsonist in the labor market. So essentially that's the only employer in the area. And they are a perfect competitor in the lumber market. So they take are price takers in the lumber market, but monopsonists in the labor market. And then the short run, labor is the only variable input. And then the labor market, which is what these questions are dealing with, are given in the graph above here. All right, so they ask us a few questions. All right, screen sketch. Okay. So think about, so marginal revenue product, right, is essentially the same as the firm's demand for labor. And so you should recognize this is very similar to a flip sort of mirror image of a monopoly graph, right? We refer to those as sort of the two chopsticks coming down normally in a monopolist. But in this case, we're talking about costs, right? So the curves are just flipped. So see, I deleted this. This is the supply curve of labor, and this is the marginal factor cost of labor. All right, so you know, when you're talking about a monopoly, if you're to flip this, you're talking about demand curve and marginal revenue curve. All right, so let's get into this question, part A. And a lot of these are just really interpreting the graph, being able to read the graph. This is one of those type of questions where, you know, it's a straightforward graph, but then they have all this sort of different intersecting points, or in this case, it's prices and quantities. And then they're going to ask you to identify sort of the correct prices and quantities for different things. So it's important to know, you know, which points you're looking for each thing. So part A, we're going to go identify the profit maximizing quantity of labor for Tremart. Okay, so and this is very analogous to trying to figure out price in monopolists, but it's flipped, right? So you're going to find the MFC, right? Marginal factor cost of labor curve, where that intersects the, in this case, it's the marginal revenue product, but it's also the firm's demand for labor, if you think of it that way. But, so that's the quantity, right? And then, so that's part B. So for part A is the quantity, right? So we're gonna come down, we're gonna find that equal to be 100, okay? So in the same way, we would find the quantity of monopolists, but then the trick is in part B, now they want to know the wage rate. So we got the quantity, but the thing is the supply curve for labor is way down here, right? So at this quantity, workers are willing to work for a much lower wage than up here, right? So in the same way in a monopoly, you would go all the way up to the demand curve. In this case, we're talking about labor. We're going to sort of travel all the way down to the supply curve. And because this firm is the only sort of employer in town, they're able to offer the wage much lower at the supply curve of labor, right? So over here, we're going to find that equals to be $10. So it's really just the flip mirror image of doing a monopoly priced. Find this point, right? That gives you your quantity, and then you travel down to the supply curve, right? So you get a value of $10 for the wage rate there. Okay. Let's go on to part C. Identify the quantity of labor hired in each of the following situations. Tremart operates in a competitive labor market. Okay, so now sort of take away the monopsony aspect of this question. On this graph, where would this firm hire if the market was competitive? Well, they would hire where essentially demand for labor equals supply of labor. So where these two curves intersect up here at this point would be sort of the natural clearing point of a competitive market. So, and the question is about the quantity. We don't have to say the price, but the price would be a little bit higher, obviously, right? So, and we come down here, quantity would be, in this case, 200 equals quantity. So you see if they're the only employer in town, they hire at a less quantity and pay a lower wage rate than if they were having to compete to get workers, right? They would offer a higher price and be at a higher quantity. All right, so I'm going to erase some of these points just so we can kind of clear this up. Okay. All right, so let's go to part 2 of part C. The government imposes a minimum wage of $12.50, and they want to know what happens to the quantity of labor in this case. So same question as part 1, but now where there's a minimum wage imposed. So I'm going to, let's say, kind of orange. All right, minimum wage at $12.50. Now the question is, what quantity are we going to employ here? So you're going to come across at $12.50 where that intersects the supply curve. We're going to end up at $150. So the best way to think about this is the supply curve down here, right? Supply curve of labor is no longer down here, right? The minimum, according to the government minimum wage here is going to be $12.50. So think about this supply curve because this part here is below $12.50. Think about it as kind of a kinked supply curve of labor going this way, right? If that makes sense. Nobody is willing to supply or is able to supply the labor for below the minimum. So effectively, this part of the curve gets bent over to this way. So they're going to go all the way across over here to where that intersects the supply curve there, and your quantity should be equal to 150.